"You're coming with us. We need a dad," black twins told the lonely millionaire at the park. He thought it was just another quiet day, sitting on his bench, feeding the birds. But when two children walked up to him, their words shattered his world. "Mommy says, you're our daddy." What begins as a simple encounter in the park turns into a battle for truth, love, and survival. Because these twins don't just need a father. Their mother is hiding a painful secret, and the town is ready to tear them apart. Is he really their dad or something even more unexpected? And when prejudice, sickness, and the past come crashing down, will this lonely man finally find family or lose everything all over again? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Springs Park as Jonathan Harrow settled onto his usual bench, the worn wooden slats familiar beneath him. His expensive wool coat did little to ward off the deeper chill that had settled in his bones since Martha's passing 3 years ago. From his pocket, he pulled out a paper bag filled with birdseed, a morning ritual that gave his empty days some semblance of purpose. "Here you go, little ones," he murmured, scattering the seeds in gentle arcs. A cluster of sparrows hopped forward, pecking eagerly at his offering. The sight brought a faint smile to his weathered face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. All around him, the park buzzed with life. A young mother pushed a stroller while chatting on her phone. Two joggers laughed as they passed, their breath visible in the crisp air. Near the playground, a father lifted his giggling daughter onto his shoulders, her delighted squeals carrying across the morning stillness. Jonathan watched them all with a detached sort of sadness. His massive Tudor mansion on Highland Avenue stood silent and empty, its 14 rooms echoing with memories of a happier time. Martha had always wanted children, but their careers had gotten in the way. Now, his success felt hollow. All those millions in the bank couldn't buy back the family they'd never started. He checked his platinum watch, 7:15. Time to head back to another day of meaningless meetings and quiet meals alone. As he gathered his coat around him and prepared to stand, movement caught his eye. Two children approached his bench with determined steps. They were African American, obviously twins, and couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The girl walked slightly ahead, her chin lifted with surprising confidence, while the boy hung back half a step, studying Jonathan with thoughtful eyes. Before Jonathan could react, the girl planted herself directly in front of him. Her brother moved to stand beside her, and though quieter, his presence was equally resolute. Jonathan found himself pinned by their matched gazes, the girl's bold and challenging, the boy's gentle but unwavering. "You're coming with us," the girl announced firmly, as if stating an undeniable fact. "We need a dad." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The paper bag of birdseed slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, scattering across his polished leather shoes. The sparrows scattered, but Jonathan barely noticed, too shocked by the words that had just upended his carefully ordered world. He sat frozen on his bench, staring at these two children, who had appeared out of nowhere to shake the foundations of his solitary existence with 6 simple words. The morning sun continued to rise over Willow Springs Park, but for Jonathan Harrow, time stood perfectly still. Jonathan's hands trembled as he stared at the two children standing before him. The birdseed bag slipped from his fingers, scattering across the ground. The twins, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, gazed up at him with matching determined expressions. I don't understand," Jonathan stammered, his usual composed demeanor cracking. "What do you mean you need a dad?" The girl, with bright eyes and braided hair, put her hands on her hips. "Mom said you used to live in the big house where she worked. She told us you're our father." Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. He forced a nervous laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "There must be some mistake. I don't even know who your mother is." "Clara Williams," the boy said firmly. "She cleaned your house for 5 years." The name hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Clara Williams. Of course, he remembered her, the quiet, dignified maid who had worked in his mansion years ago. His mind raced through calculations he didn't want to make. "Listen, children," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "These are very serious claims. You shouldn't go around saying such things to strangers." The girl's chin lifted stubbornly. "We're not strangers. We're your kids. Mom has a picture of you from back then." Jonathan's heart pounded against his ribs. The twins stood their ground, their eyes, so serious, so certain, fixed on his face. There was something in their features, something hauntingly familiar that he couldn't quite place. "Zara, Daniel." A woman's voice cut through the morning air. Jonathan looked up to see Clara Williams hurrying across the park. She wore neat, simple clothes and carried herself with the same quiet dignity he remembered from years ago. When their eyes met, she stopped short, color draining from her face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrow," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She grabbed each child by the shoulder. "They shouldn't have bothered you." "Mom, we just wanted to." The boy, Daniel, started to protest. "Hush now." Clara cut him off, but her hands trembled on their shoulders. Jonathan couldn't find his voice. He watched as Clara guided the twins away, their small faces, turning back to look at him until their mother urged them forward. Just before they disappeared down the park path, Clara glanced back one final time. Her expression, a mixture of fear and something else, regret, perhaps. Alone on his bench once more, Jonathan sat perfectly still, the scattered birdseed forgotten at his feet. The twins' words echoed in his mind, and unwanted memories of that time period surfaced. Late nights at the office, too much whiskey, Martha away visiting her sick mother for months. His carefully ordered world suddenly felt like it was built on shifting sand. For the first time in years, the morning silence felt not just empty, but heavy with unanswered questions. Jonathan's hands shook as he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey in his dimly lit study. The crystal decanter clinked against the glass, betraying his unsteady nerves. Outside his mansion's windows, darkness had settled over the manicured lawns, but he couldn't find peace in the familiar evening routine. "Clara Williams," he whispered to the empty room, the name bringing forth a flood of memories he'd buried years ago. He settled into his leather armchair, the one facing the stone fireplace where only cold ashes remained. The children's faces swam before his eyes, their determined expressions, their bold confidence. How much they looked like their mother. Clara had worked in his house for 5 years, keeping everything running smoothly after his wife Sarah's death. She had been more than just efficient. She'd been a quiet presence that somehow made the enormous house feel less empty. Jonathan took a long sip of whiskey, remembering that night 11 years ago. The funeral had been unbearable. All those people offering condolences he didn't want to hear. After everyone left, he'd found himself in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking straight from a wine bottle. Clara had been there too, working late as always. "She was so kind to me," he murmured, remembering how Clara had sat with him, listening as he talked about Sarah for hours. The wine had flowed, their guards had dropped, and in their shared grief and loneliness, Jonathan set his glass down hard enough to splash whiskey onto the mahogany side table. That one night had changed everything. The next morning, they'd both pretended nothing happened. 2 weeks later, Clara had resigned, leaving only a polite note about family obligations. Sleep eluded him that night. As dawn broke, Jonathan knew what he had to do. He spent the morning making calls, using his considerable resources to find Clara's address. By early afternoon, he stood outside a modest apartment building in the east side of town, gathering his courage. When Clara emerged from the building, she stopped short at the sight of him. She looked older, with touches of gray in her hair, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity he remembered. "I should have known they'd find you," she said softly, no surprise in her voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonathan's voice cracked with emotion. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she held her head high. "What would you have done? Thrown money at us? I wanted my children to have more than that. They deserved to grow up knowing who they were, not as some rich man's secret." "But you told them about me?" "I never lied to them," Clara said firmly. "They asked about their father, and I told them the truth. That you lived in the big house where I worked, that you were a good man who lost his wife. I never asked for anything, Jonathan. Never wanted your money. I just couldn't bear for them not to know who their father was." The truth of it all settled over Jonathan like a heavy blanket. 2 children, his children. All these years, they had been growing up just across town, carrying half of his DNA, while he sat alone in his empty mansion. Jonathan stood awkwardly by the park entrance, checking his expensive watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. His polished, leather shoes felt out of place among the wood chips and grass. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had been absent from his life for far too long. "Mr. Harrow, you really came." Zara's voice rang out across the playground. She was running toward him, her purple backpack bouncing against her shoulders, while Daniel followed at a more measured pace, a book tucked under his arm. Yes, well, I said I would," Jonathan replied stiffly, unconsciously straightening his tie. He had traded his usual suit for khakis and a sweater, but still felt overdressed for a playground visit. Zara grabbed his hand without hesitation, making him flinch at the unexpected contact. Her small fingers were warm and sticky, probably from whatever snack she'd had after school. "Come on, we want to show you our favorite spot." Daniel fell into step beside them, looking up at Jonathan with quiet curiosity. "Do you like to read, Mr. Harrow?" he asked softly, showing him the worn copy of Bridge to Terabithia he was carrying. "I do, actually." Jonathan found himself answering, surprised by how easily the conversation flowed. "Though I haven't read that particular book." "It's really good." Daniel smiled, his eyes lighting up. Maybe we could read it together sometime." Something in Jonathan's chest tightened at the hopeful tone in the boy's voice. Before he could respond, Zara tugged him toward the swings. "First, you have to push us. Mom says you're really tall, so you can push us really high." For the next hour, Jonathan found himself doing things he hadn't done in decades. He pushed swings, watched impromptu dance performances, and listened to elaborate stories about school adventures. Zara's infectious enthusiasm drew him out of his shell, while Daniel's thoughtful questions engaged his mind in unexpected ways. "Watch this," Zara called out, attempting a cartwheel that ended in a tumble. Instead of crying, she, laughed, grass stains on her knees. Jonathan found himself chuckling too, the sound foreign to his own ears. As the afternoon light began to fade, they sat on a bench, the same bench where he'd first met them. Daniel shared his afternoon snack of graham crackers, insisting that Jonathan take one. Zara hummed a tune she was learning on the piano, swinging her legs in rhythm. Later that night, Jonathan stood in his massive foyer, the silence no longer feeling quite as empty. He could still feel the phantom warmth of their small hands in his, Zara's energetic grip and Daniel's gentle touch. Their laughter echoed in his memory, chasing away some of the loneliness that had been his constant companion. Standing in front of the large mirror in his hallway, Jonathan looked at his reflection. The man staring back seemed different somehow, less rigid, more human. He touched his cheek, surprised to find the ghost of a smile there. "Maybe," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet house, "maybe I can try." Jonathan shifted his weight from one foot to another outside Clara's modest apartment building. The peeling paint and cracked concrete steps were a stark contrast to his tailored suit. He knocked on the door, his knuckles barely touching the worn wood before it opened. Clara stood in the doorway, her eyes tired but watchful. "They're just getting their shoes on," she said quietly. The twins burst past their mother with excited grins. "Can we go to the park again?" Daniel asked, bouncing on his toes. "Actually," Jonathan replied, his voice gentler than usual, "I thought we could take a walk around the neighborhood today." As they strolled down the sidewalk, Zara skipped ahead while Daniel hung back, studying Jonathan's face as if memorizing every detail. The boy's searching looks reminded Jonathan so much of himself that it made his chest tight. "Mrs. Peterson, next door had to move away," Zara announced suddenly, her skip turning into a shuffle. "She made the best cookies." Daniel nodded solemnly. "Mr. Roberts, he owns the building. He told Mommy that people like us don't belong here anymore." "What does that mean?" Jonathan's steps faltered. He glanced back at Clara's building, noting the other well-kept apartments surrounding it. Understanding dawned like a cold wave washing over him. The landlord said that? Jonathan kept his voice steady, though anger sparked in his chest. "Mommy cried when she thought we were sleeping," Zara added, her small hand slipping into Jonathan's. "Are we going to have to leave too?" The touch of her hand, so trusting and warm, made Jonathan's throat tighten. These children, his children, shouldn't have to understand what prejudice meant at such a young age. The weight of his years of absence pressed down on him like a physical burden. They completed their walk as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jonathan watched as Clara called the twins inside from the doorway, their small bodies disappearing into the building that might not be their home much longer. Standing alone on the cracked sidewalk, Jonathan clenched his fists. The familiar guilt of his absence was still there, but now something else burned alongside it, a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about making up for lost time or easing his conscience. This was about standing up against the kind of prejudice that would dare threaten these bright, beautiful children and their strong-willed mother. His jaw tightened as he watched the shadows lengthen across Clara's building. The family he'd never known he wanted, the family he'd denied for so long, needed him now. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Harrow knew exactly what he had to do. Jonathan's silver Bentley became a regular sight on Cedar Street, parked between weather-worn sedans and rusty pickup trucks. Each afternoon, he'd climb the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B, his leather briefcase filled with homework supplies and chess pieces. Night to E4. Daniel said softly, his small finger hovering over the chess piece. Jonathan leaned forward, studying the board with exaggerated concentration. Good move. He nodded, pride warming his chest. You're getting better every day. From the tiny living room, Zara's piano practice filled the apartment with simple melodies. She'd insisted on showing Jonathan her progress, her fingers dancing across the worn keys of the upright piano Clara had bought secondhand. Mrs. Martinez from next door would often peek out her door, smiling and waving at Jonathan. So nice to see a father spending time with his children, she'd say. Though her eyes held questions, she was too polite to ask. Not everyone was as welcoming. Mr. Peterson from the first floor would cross his arms and stare whenever Jonathan passed by. Fancy man with his fancy car. He'd mutter just loud enough to hear. Think he owns the place now? Clara kept her distance during these visits, but Jonathan could feel her watching from the kitchen, her presence both comforting and unsettling. She'd bring glasses of lemonade or plates of cookies, then retreat to fold laundry or prepare dinner. One evening, after helping Zara master a particularly challenging piano piece and watching Daniel checkmate him for the first time, Clara surprised him. Would you like to stay for dinner? She asked quietly. Jonathan hesitated, his heart beating faster. The apartment smelled of fried chicken and fresh rolls, and the twins immediately grabbed his hands. Please stay, they begged in unison. Well, I suppose I could, he said, trying to sound casual despite the emotion tightening his throat. The kitchen table was small, covered with a checkered cloth that had seen better days. 4 mismatched plates were set out, along with paper napkins folded into triangles. Jonathan sat where Zara directed him, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. Clara placed a steaming platter in the center of the table. The twins automatically joined hands, and Clara reached out to complete the circle. Jonathan stared at their offered hands for a moment before taking them. Dear Lord, Clara began, her voice soft but steady. We thank you for this food and for bringing us together as a family. Jonathan's throat tightened at the word family. The twins' small hands were warm in his, and Clara's gentle touch sent a current of belonging through him he hadn't felt since his wife passed. Yet fear crept in, alongside the joy, fear of these precious moments being temporary, fear of losing this newfound warmth, fear of not deserving this second chance at happiness. He opened his eyes to see Zara peeking at him through her lashes, a knowing smile on her face. Daniel squeezed his hand gently, as if sensing his inner turmoil. Clara's amen brought him back to the present moment, to this humble kitchen filled with more love than his massive mansion had known in years. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Jonathan Harrow sat stiffly in his Sunday best, aware of the hushed conversations and sideways glances from the congregation around him. Clara sat beside him in a crisp blue dress, her head held high despite the whispers. The twins, dressed in their Sunday finest, flanked them on either side. Zara fidgeted with the ribbon in her hair while Daniel thumbed through the hymnal. A woman 2 rows back whispered loudly enough for Jonathan to catch. That's Jonathan Harrow with Clara Williams and her children. The millionaire from Oakwood Heights? Another voice responded. What's he doing here with them? Jonathan's jaw tightened. He'd expected this reaction when Clara invited him to church, but the reality of it stung more than he'd anticipated. He'd attended services at First Presbyterian his whole life. But today he sat here, in this modest Baptist church, feeling both out of place and exactly where he needed to be. The pastor's voice rang out clear and strong. Today's sermon is about love that knows no boundaries. Jonathan caught Clara's slight smile at those words. The timing felt almost divine. Throughout the service, the whispers continued. Some were curious, others disapproving. An elderly deacon near the front kept turning around to stare, his expression a mix of confusion and judgment. Jonathan noticed how some parents pulled their children closer when they walked past, as if his presence beside this black family somehow threatened their own world. Brothers and sisters, the pastor continued, we are all God's children. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Zara leaned against Jonathan's arm, seemingly oblivious to the stares. Her small hand reached for the hymnal, and she shared it with him as the congregation stood for the final song. The familiar melody of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary. Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat as Zara's small fingers found his hand. She squeezed it gently, looking up at him with a bright smile that carried no trace of the judgment surrounding them. In that moment, the whispers faded away. He stood straighter, his voice joining the congregation in song. Clara's rich alto harmonized perfectly with Zara's clear, high notes. Even quiet Daniel hummed along. They weren't just four individuals standing in a pew anymore. They were a family. The realization hit Jonathan like a ray of sunlight breaking through clouds. He didn't care what anyone thought. Let them stare. Let them whisper. The warmth of Zara's hand in his, the sound of their voices joining together in praise, this was what mattered. For the first time in years, he felt truly proud, not of his wealth or status, but of who he was becoming and the family he was choosing to love. The morning sun filtered through Jonathan's study windows as he stared at the DNA testing kit on his desk. His fingers drummed nervously against the polished mahogany surface while Clara sat across from him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded, her eyes gentle but determined. "We need to know, Jonathan, for the twins' sake, for all our sakes." The testing process itself was simple enough. Just a quick cheek swab. But as Jonathan sealed the envelope containing their samples, his hands trembled slightly. This small package held the power to change everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Jonathan found himself checking his mailbox multiple times a day. The waiting felt endless. He threw himself into work, reviewing contracts and acquisition proposals, but his mind kept drifting to Zara and Daniel. He'd grown so fond of their weekend chess matches, their excited chatter about school, the way Zara's face lit up when she mastered a new piano piece. During one particularly restless evening, Jonathan paced his study, pausing at the window to watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What if?" he murmured to himself, unable to complete the thought. The possibility of not being their father made his chest tighten uncomfortably. Clara called him every few days, her voice carrying the same mix of anxiety and hope that he felt. "No news yet?" she would ask, trying to keep her tone light. "Nothing yet," he would reply, both of them understanding the weight of the waiting. Finally, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Jonathan's housekeeper brought in the mail. Among the usual business correspondence was a plain white envelope from the medical laboratory. His heart jumped to his throat as he picked it up, its contents suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. He sat at his massive dining table, the envelope before him like a ticking time bomb. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warming his shoulders, but he felt cold inside. With fingers that didn't quite feel like his own, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the crisp paper inside. His eyes scanned the document, medical terminology blurring together until they landed on the conclusion section. The words seemed to leap off the page, each one striking like a physical blow. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested children. The paper slipped from his trembling hands, floating down to rest on the polished table surface. Jonathan sat there, completely still, as the weight of the truth settled over him. The silence of his massive dining room pressed in around him, suddenly feeling more suffocating than ever before. All he could think about was Zara's bright smile and Daniel's determined face as he contemplated his next chess move. The test results lay there on the table, but the love he'd developed for these children felt no less real, no less powerful. Yet now, everything had changed. Clara's tears fell freely as she sat in Jonathan's study. The DNA results scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. Her hands trembled as she tried to explain through her sobs. I wasn't completely sure," she admitted, her voice breaking. "That night, there was someone else. Shortly before, I truly hoped it was you. I wanted it to be you." Jonathan stood by the window, his back rigid, processing her words. The betrayal cut deep, making his chest tight. He'd opened his heart, let himself believe in this chance at family, only to have it shattered by a simple piece of paper. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" His voice came out hoarse, strained with emotion. "You let me believe. Because I saw how you were with them," Clara interrupted, wiping her eyes. "How they changed you, how you changed them. They need a father, Jonathan. They need you." As if on cue, the study door burst open. Zara and Daniel rushed in, their faces streaked with tears. They must have been listening outside. The twins threw themselves at Jonathan, wrapping their arms around his waist. "Please don't leave us," Zara sobbed, burying her face in his suit jacket. "You're our dad. You teach me piano and help with my homework." Daniel clung just as tightly. "You showed me how to play chess. You're the only dad we've ever had." Jonathan's hands hovered uncertainly over their heads. The truth of the DNA test warred with the undeniable love he felt for these children. Their tears soaked through his clothes, their small bodies shaking with sobs. I need time to think," he managed to say, gently disentangling himself from their embrace. "Please, just give me some time." Clara gathered the twins, who resisted leaving, their pleas echoing in the hallway as she led them out. Jonathan watched them go, his heart heavy in his chest. The night stretched endlessly as he paced his mansion's empty halls. Each room held fresh memories. Zara practicing at the piano in the music room, Daniel concentrating over chess pieces in the library, family dinners in the dining room filled with laughter and prayer. He found himself in his late wife's garden, where the moonlight cast silver shadows across the roses she'd once tended. What would she have said about all this? She'd always wanted children, but they'd never been blessed with any. The sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in soft pinks and golds. Jonathan's footsteps carried him back inside, his decision crystallizing with the dawn. He found Clara and the twins in the kitchen, where they'd apparently spent the night waiting. Kneeling before Zara and Daniel, he took their small hands in his. Their eyes, still red from crying, watched him anxiously. Jonathan's voice was soft but sure as he whispered, "Blood doesn't matter. I'm here. I choose you." The mahogany-paneled town council chamber buzzed with tension as Jonathan Harrow adjusted his tie, taking his usual seat in the back row. The room was packed tonight. He could feel the weight of stairs as Clara slipped into the seat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. At the front, Clara's landlord, Mr. Peterson, stood at the podium, his voice dripping with false concern. "It's about maintaining property values," he insisted, gesturing to his proposed housing ordinance. "We need to be selective about who lives in certain neighborhoods." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Peterson meant by selective. He glanced at Clara, seeing the quiet dignity in her posture, even as her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Furthermore," Peterson continued, "I propose stricter screening processes for tenants in the historic district." That was enough. Jonathan stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Heads turned as he made his way to the front, his expensive shoes clicking against the tiles. Clara's soft gasp echoed in the sudden silence. "Mr. Harrow," the council chairman acknowledged, surprise evident in his voice. "You wish to speak?" "I do." Jonathan's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "I've sat silent through too many of these meetings, watching good people get pushed out of their homes through thinly veiled discrimination." Peterson's face reddened. "Now see here, Harrow." "No, you see here." Jonathan cut him off, his voice steady but firm. "I've known Clara Williams and her children for months now. They're more deserving of a home in this town than anyone in this room. What you're proposing isn't about property values. It's about prejudice, plain and simple." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jonathan could see some nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "And to prove my commitment to real change in Willow Springs," Jonathan continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase, "I'm pledging half of my fortune to build a community center. It will be named after Zara and Daniel Williams, and it will be open to everyone, regardless of their race or economic status." The room erupted. Some people jumped to their feet, applauding, while others sat stone-faced. Peterson sputtered, his proposed ordinance forgotten in the commotion. Clara stood slowly, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Jonathan with a mixture of gratitude and awe. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Jonathan felt lighter than he had in years. He'd spent so long hiding behind his wealth, using it as a shield. Now, finally, he was using it as a sword, cutting through the prejudice that threatened the family he'd grown to love. As the applause continued to echo through the chamber, Jonathan caught Clara's eye and nodded slightly. It didn't matter what the DNA test had said. This was what family really meant. I was standing up for each other, fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. The aroma of Clara's famous chicken soup filled her small kitchen as she stirred the pot, humming softly. Jonathan sat at the worn kitchen table, helping Zara with her math homework while Daniel practiced chess moves nearby. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday evening with their newly formed family. The denominator goes on the bottom. See? Jonathan pointed at Zara's notebook. That's why they call it the bottom num. His words cut short as a clatter echoed through the kitchen. The wooden spoon Clara had been holding clattered to the floor, followed by the terrible sound of her body crumpling against the cabinets. "Clara!" Jonathan leaped from his chair, crossing the kitchen in 2 long strides. She lay motionless on the linoleum, her skin clammy and pale. "Call 911, he shouted to the twins, who stood frozen in terror. The next hour passed, in a blur of sirens, fluorescent lights, and antiseptic smells. Jonathan paced the emergency room waiting area, his expensive shoes wearing a path in the cheap carpet. Zara and Daniel huddled together on plastic chairs, their small hands clasped tightly. When the doctor finally appeared, his grave expression made Jonathan's heart sink. "Mr. Harrow, could you step into my office?" The words that followed hit like physical blows. Advanced stage. Pancreatic cancer. Spread to surrounding tissues. Limited time. Jonathan gripped the edge of the doctor's desk, his knuckles white. How? How long? Weeks. Maybe a month or two at most. I'm so sorry. Back in Clara's hospital room, she lay against stark white pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. The twins curled up on either side of her bed, their faces streaked with tears. Jonathan watched through the window, his chest tight with an agony he hadn't felt since losing his wife. "Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" he asked later, after the twins had fallen asleep in the chairs beside her bed. Clara's eyes, though tired, held their usual strength. "I thought it was just exhaustion. Working 2 jobs, raising the kids." She reached for his hand. "I should have known better." Jonathan squeezed her fingers, fighting back tears. "We'll fight this. I'll get the best doctors. Try experimental treatments." "Jonathan," she interrupted softly, "promise me you'll take care of them." He couldn't speak, could only nod as the weight of her request settled over him. Later that night, after Clara had drifted off to sleep and the twins were taken home by a neighbor, Jonathan found himself in the hospital's small chapel. The space was empty, lit only by flickering candles. He sank into the front pew, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Please," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. It had been years since he'd prayed, not since Sarah's death. "Don't take them from me too. Not again. Please. I can't lose another family." His words echoed in the empty chapel, mixing with the sound of his weeping as the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sat up in her hospital bed, her chin lifted with determination despite the dark circles under her eyes. "I won't spend my last days in this sterile box," she declared, smoothing the thin blanket across her lap. "My babies need memories of their mama at home, not hooked up to machines." Jonathan understood. Within days, he'd transformed Clara's small apartment into a comfortable care facility, complete with medical equipment discreetly tucked away. He hired the best home health nurses, but made sure they stayed in the background, preserving the warmth of their family time. Movie night. Zara announced one evening, waving a DVD of The Lion King. Daniel sprawled on the floor with a bowl of popcorn, while Clara rested on the couch, wrapped in her favorite quilt. Jonathan sat beside her, noticing how she smiled through her fatigue. They created moments wherever they could. Weekend picnics in the living room when Clara felt too weak to go outside. Story time, where each person added a piece to an ongoing tale. Game nights where Clara coached Daniel in chess, while Jonathan helped Zara build card houses. "Remember this," Clara would whisper sometimes, watching her children laugh. Jonathan knew she was creating memories to sustain them. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Clara stood in the twins' doorway, leaning heavily on Jonathan's arm. They watched as he tucked each child in, kissing foreheads and adjusting blankets with a tenderness that still surprised him. After the nightlight was switched on and the door pulled nearly closed, Clara gripped Jonathan's sleeve. Her eyes, though tired, burned with intensity. "Promise me you won't leave them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They need you." Jonathan felt tears well up in his eyes as he covered her hand with his. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, but his promise was clear in the gentle squeeze of his fingers. Clara's cough echoed through her hospital room as Jonathan helped her sit up against the pillows. Her once strong frame had grown frail, but her eyes still held that fierce determination he'd come to admire. "We need to talk about the children," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to have full custody when—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jonathan squeezed her hand. "I'll take care of everything." But Walter Griggs, the landlord who'd tried to evict Clara months ago, had other plans. When word spread about Jonathan's petition for guardianship, Griggs filed a formal objection with the court. "It's not natural," Griggs proclaimed loudly in the courthouse hallway. "A white millionaire raising colored children? There's something wrong there." The courtroom crackled with tension as Judge Margaret Ellis called the hearing to order. Jonathan sat straight-backed in his suit, while his lawyer presented documentation of his financial stability and the strong bond he'd formed with the twins. "Mr. Harrow has been a father figure to these children," his attorney argued. "He's provided them with love, support, and stability." The opposition painted a different picture. "Mr. Harrow has no experience raising African-American children," Griggs's lawyer insisted. "They need to be with their own kind." Judge Ellis's eyes narrowed at the thinly veiled prejudice. "This court deals in facts, counselor, not stereotypes." Clara testified from her wheelchair, her voice weak but resolute. "Jonathan loves my children. He sees them, not their color. That's all I've ever wanted for them." When Judge Ellis delivered her verdict, the courtroom fell silent. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimonies, I find Jonathan Harrow not only suitable but exemplary as guardian. Custody granted." Zara and Daniel burst from their seats, tears streaming down their faces as they ran toward Jonathan. "Daddy!" they cried in unison, throwing themselves into his arms. Jonathan held them tight, his own tears falling freely as Clara watched with a peaceful smile. In that moment, they weren't black or white, rich or poor. They were simply family, bound by love stronger than blood or prejudice. The hospice room was bathed in soft afternoon light, filtering through sheer curtains that danced with the gentle breeze. Clara lay peacefully in her bed, her breathing shallow but steady, while Jonathan sat beside her, holding her delicate hand. Zara and Daniel nestled close on either side of their mother's bed, their young faces solemn yet filled with love. "Psalm 23, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel opened the worn Bible that had been Clara's constant companion and began reading, his voice clear and strong despite his tears. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Zara's fingers found the familiar keys of the small electronic keyboard they'd brought to the hospice. She played softly, the hymn Amazing Grace floating through the room as Jonathan and Daniel's voices joined in harmony. Clara's smile grew wider, her eyes shining with pride and peace. "My beautiful babies," she murmured, looking at each of them in turn. "God brought us together, all of us. This is what faith looks like." Her gaze met Jonathan's. "Thank you for choosing them, for choosing us." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "Clara, you gave me the greatest gift, a family." As the sun began to set, Clara's breathing became more peaceful. With one final, contented smile, she closed her eyes, her hand still warm in Jonathan's grasp as she slipped away. At the funeral 3 days later, the little church overflowed with people. The same congregation that had once whispered and stared now stood in solidarity, offering casseroles, hugs, and prayers. Jonathan held Zara and Daniel close as they stood before Clara's flower-covered casket. The pastor spoke of Clara's strength, her unwavering faith, and the love that had created a family beyond blood. Throughout the service, neighbors who had once turned away now approached with gentle words and supportive embraces. Even those who had opposed Jonathan's guardianship came forward to pay their respects, moved by the obvious love between him and the children. As they listened to the choir sing Clara's favorite hymn, Jonathan felt the weight of both sorrow and belonging settle in his heart. He looked down at his children, his family, and knew that Clara's love would live on through them. The morning air was crisp as Jonathan walked through Willow Springs Park, feeling the gentle pressure of small hands in his. The path was familiar, but everything felt different now. Zara skipped occasionally on his left, while Daniel walked steadily on his right, each carrying a bright blue balloon. "Look, Daddy," Zara pointed. "There's your bench." Jonathan smiled, remembering that first morning when two bold children had approached him there. "That's where you two changed my life," he said softly. They stopped at the weathered wooden bench, and Jonathan helped the twins sit down. From his pocket, he pulled out 3 small cards and some string. "Ready to write your messages to Mommy?" Daniel nodded solemnly, taking his card with careful hands. Zara grabbed hers eagerly, already knowing what she wanted to say. Jonathan watched as they wrote, their faces scrunched in concentration. "Dear Mommy," Zara read aloud as she tied her card to the balloon string. "I'm playing piano every day, just like you taught me. Daddy says I'm getting really good. I love you lots." Daniel's message was shorter. "I miss you, Mommy. I'm taking care of Zara and Daddy for you. We're okay." Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he attached his own card. The children looked up at him expectantly, and he read, "Thank you, Clara, for giving me the greatest gift, our children." Together, they stood and released the balloons. 3 blue dots rose against the clear sky, carrying their love heavenward. Tears streamed down Jonathan's face as he watched them float away. "You came to save me," he whispered, thinking of that lonely morning months ago. Zara and Daniel turned to him, their faces shining with love and wisdom beyond their years. Together they answered, "No, Daddy, you saved us." Jonathan gathered them close, feeling truly whole for the first time in years. In this moment, he understood that redemption wasn't just about being saved. It was about the love, faith, and hope that had brought them all together. Thank you for being here. Thanks for watching this, Peter. One for more. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.